This is such a treat to come back to where I went to school and read my finished book to my teachers who helped me write it. And I really do owe a huge thanks to David Hamilton and to Amy Correa Rowe for helping me through this and pushing me and challenging me and asking me to try to work beyond white space and asking other hard questions. So my thanks for that to both of you. And I'm going to read from two essays that I began writing while I was a student here at Iowa. The first one is the first essay in the book, and it's one of the last essays I wrote here at Iowa. And the last one is the last essay in the book, and it's the first essay I wrote here at Iowa. And these essays are actually fairly different than the rest of the essays in the book. And almost every essay in the book is rooted in a place and is about a particular place. And these two essays are a little rootless, and they're both litanies, lists. The first, actually, I won't tell you what it's about. I'll read it. But they're companion pieces. They're bookending the piece because they're sister essays. So the first is called Time and Distance Overcome. Of what use is such an invention? The New York World asked shortly after Alexander Graham Bell first demonstrated his telephone in 1876. The world was not waiting for the telephone. Bell's financial backers asked him not to work on his new invention because it seemed too dubious an investment. The idea on which the telephone depended, the idea that every home in the country could be connected by a vast network of wires suspended from poles set an average of 100 feet apart, seemed far more unlikely than the idea that the human voice could be transmitted through a wire. Even now, it is an impossible idea that we are all connected, all of us. At the present time, we have a perfect network of gas pipes and water pipes throughout our large cities, Bell wrote to his business partners in defense of his idea. In a similar manner, it's conceivable that cables of telephone wires could be laid underground or suspended overhead, communicating by branch wires with private dwellings, counting houses, shops, manufactories, etc., uniting them through the main cable. Imagine the mind that could imagine this, that could see us joined by one branching cable. This was the mind of a man who wanted to invent, more than the telephone, a machine that would allow the deaf to hear. For a short time, the telephone was little more than a novelty. For 25 cents, you could see it demonstrated by Bell himself in a church, along with singing and recitations by local talent. From some distance away, Bell would receive a call from the invisible Mr. Watson. Then the telephone became a plaything of the rich. A Boston banker paid for a private line between his office and his home so that he could let his family know exactly when he would be home for dinner. Mark Twain was among the first Americans to own a telephone, but he wasn't completely taken with the device. The human voice carries entirely too far as it is, he remarked. By 1889, the New York Times was reporting a war on telephone poles. Wherever telephone companies were erecting poles, homeowners and business owners were sawing them down or defending their sidewalks with rifles. Property owners in Red Bank, New Jersey, threatened to tar and feather the workers putting up telephone poles. A judge granted a group of homeowners an injunction to prevent the telephone company from erecting any new poles. Another judge found that a man who had cut down a pole because it was, quote, obnoxious, was not guilty of malicious mischief. Telephone poles, newspaper editorials complained, were an urban blight. The poles carried a wire for each telephone, sometimes hundreds of wires. And in some places, there were also telegraph wires, power lines, and trolley cables. The sky was netted with wires. The war on telephone poles was fueled in part by that terribly American concern for private property and a reluctance to surrender it for a shared utility. And then there was a fierce sense of aesthetics, an obsession with purity, a dislike for the way the poles and wires marred a landscape that those other new inventions, skyscrapers and barbed wire, were just beginning to complicate. And then perhaps there was also a fear that distance, as it had always been known and measured, was collapsing. The city council in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, ordered policemen to cut down all the telephone poles in town. And the mayor of Oshkosh, Wisconsin, ordered the police chief and the fire department to chop down the telephone poles there. Only one pole was chopped down before the telephone men climbed all the poles along the line, preventing any more chopping. Soon, Bell Telephone Company began stationing a man at the top of each pole as soon as it had been set, until enough poles had been set to string a wire between them, at which point it became a misdemeanor to interfere with the poles. Even so, a constable cut down 2 poles holding 40 or 50 wires, and a homeowner sawed down a recently wired pole, then fled from police. The owner of a cannery ordered his workers to throw dirt back into the hole the telephone company was digging in front of his building. His men threw the dirt back in as fast as the telephone workers could dig it out. Then he sent out a team with a load of stones to dump into the hole. Eventually, the pole was erected on the other side of the street. Despite the war on telephone poles, it would take only 4 years after Bell's first public demonstration of the telephone for every town of more than 10,000 people to be wired, although many towns were wired only to themselves. By the turn of the century, there were more telephones than bathtubs in America. Time and distance overcome, read an early advertisement for the telephone. Rutherford B. Hayes pronounced the installment of a telephone in the White House one of the greatest events since creation. The telephone, Thomas Edison declared, annihilated time and space and brought the human family closer in touch. In 1898, in Lake Cormorant, Mississippi, a black man was hanged from a telephone pole. And in Weir City, Kansas, and in Brookhaven, Mississippi, and in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the hanged man was riddled with bullets. In Danville, Illinois, a black man's throat was slit, and his dead body was strung up on a telephone pole. 2 black men were hanged from a telephone pole in Lewisburg, West Virginia, and 2 in Hempstead, Texas, where one man was dragged out of the courtroom by a mob, and another was dragged out of jail. A black man was hanged from a telephone pole in Belleville, Illinois, where a fire was set at the base of the pole, and the man was cut down half alive, covered in coal oil, and burned. While his body was burning, the mob beat it with clubs and cut it to pieces. Lynching, the first scholar of the subject determined, is an American invention. Lynching from bridges, from arches, from trees standing alone in fields, from trees in front of the county courthouse, from trees used as public billboards, from trees barely able to support the weight of a man, from telephone poles, from street lamps, and from poles erected solely for that purpose. From the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, black men were lynched for crimes real and imagined, for whistles, for rumors, for disputing with a white man, for unpopularity, for asking a white woman in marriage, for peeping in a window. The children's game of telephone depends on the fact that a message passed quietly from one ear to another will get distorted at some point along the line. In Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a black man charged with kicking a white girl was hanged from a telephone pole. In Longview, Texas, a black man accused of attacking a white woman was hanged from a telephone pole. In Greenville, Mississippi, a black man accused of attacking a white telephone operator was hanged from a telephone pole. In Purcell, Oklahoma, a black man accused of attacking a white woman was tied to a telephone pole and burned. Men and women in automobiles stood up to watch him die, reads the newspaper account. The poles, of course, were not to blame. It was only coincidence that they became convenient as gallows, because they were tall and straight, with a crossbar, and because they stood in public places. And it was only coincidence that the telephone poles so closely resembled crucifixes.